MC Jasmine. Hi, everybody. My name is Adon Moss. I'm the Foresight lead with HRI. Before I get started, I'm combating the flu, so if I suddenly have a brain fart or run away from the computer screen, you'll know why. A little about me before I start the presentation. I'm new to the Canadian Federal Public Service. I went to law school once upon a time and hated it, and got involved in with the Ontario Public Service, where I worked in Cabinet Office as a policy consultant, I want to say, and part of my work was practicing strategic foresight, so helping teams kind of look down the line in the work they do to kind of foresee what's happening out there, so that they're better prepared. And yeah, I'm fortunate to now work with HRI and build our foresight team here. So just going to share my screen now. Okay. So yeah, we're the strategic foresight team. We're with the Human Resources Innovation unit and in the Strategic Directions and Management Services. Today I'm going to tell you a little bit about what foresight is, a little bit about what our team does and what our team's planning to do down the line. So strategic foresight, colloquially known as future studies. It's a structured and systematic way to consider and prepare for the future. It's not forecasting. For those of you familiar with forecasting, that's taking historical or current data and projecting a straight line out into the future, suggesting that what we know before and now is going to happen again in the future. And as we know, that never really typically is the case. The future is usually a squiggly line of different events that change all the time. So we're not about forecasting anything. Rather, we're thinking about the multitude of futures that could potentially occur and how well can we prepare for any of them to transpire. We're also not making predictions. We're not going to tell you exactly what that future looks like, but we're going to try and get an idea of what it might look like. What are the varying characteristics of any one future, so that again, that we have kind of a sense of understanding of what's looming ahead. And then foresight's really about the long term. I know in government we're thinking 1 to 5 years based on budgets or political cycles, but foresight's really about that long-term lens, the 10 to 20 years. And the reason for that is because we want to have a policy or a program or a strategy that's agile and robust, so that when things change in the future, inevitably they do. We saw how drastic that can be with the pandemic, that the policy programs already thought about these big changes, and it's much more adaptable and ready for change. If you assume that the singular future, or if you assume a singular future, and everything you've created in your policy or program is based on that future, and that future doesn't turn out, then you're in a little bit of trouble. Another way to look at foresight is trying to discover the unknown. So I have this categorized in 4 knowns and unknowns. So we have the known known. So we know what we know. That's gravity, right? We know what gravity is. We know what it does. We know its effect on us. Great, no problem. Then there's the known unknowns. So we know they exist, but we don't really know what they do or why they do what they do. So black holes are a good example, right? We can see them in the universe kind of bending time and energy, but we don't really know anything about them. They're just kind of there looming. And we're trying to figure out as much as we can about them, but we're limited in what we know about them. Then there's the unknown knowns. So things we know, but we don't know that we know them. And that's in the subconscious. So our biases, our heuristics, the things that we're not even actively aware of that we're thinking. So Foresight tries to unearth those, right? Like try and challenge our assumptions, try and challenge prejudices we have that we're not even consciously aware that we have them. Then there's the unknown unknowns. They're so inconceivable that we don't even know that they could even exist, and we don't even know what they are, even if we did. In strategic foresight, we call these black swans. So they are major events that that transformatively change how we conceive of or how we operate in our lives, or how we conceive of things. So, 9/11 is a very good example. The fall of the Berlin Wall is considered a black swan event. So things that completely changed the geopolitical situation internationally. And it gets its name from this anecdote of in the 17th century Netherlands, everybody thought they understood what a swan was. It's this, beautiful white bird that struts around, blah, 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 floats around, great. And then one day, off of a boat, walks a black swan. And it completely changed the notion of what a white swan was. Now, if there's a black swan, maybe there's a blue swan, maybe there's a red swan. We don't even know anymore what a swan could possibly be. So these are something that strategic foresight is really keeping a watchful eye on, because it changes how we understand everything. Again, it's arguable COVID-19 was foreseeable to some, but it wasn't for a lot of other people. And because we didn't have that foresight, we weren't necessarily ready to change as quickly as we could have. Just going to quickly share my cone of plausibility that Shreya has designed for me. So this is, I find this is a really helpful image too about foresight. So you have the past, which is these forking roads that ultimately converge into a singular point of now. Everything in the past is our current single space we're in. And then it projects out into the future. So we have the possible, which is at the wide range of things that could happen. Aliens could land. There could be some horrible zombie apocalypse that could change everything, but we don't really worry about those things. They're conceivable, but not really, and so foresight doesn't really worry about it. We're more interested in the plausible, so things that are within the realm of likelihood that they could occur. What they are, we don't really know, but that's really where foresight is interested in examining things. You have in the middle the probable, so that's kind of what I was talking about earlier about that single future projecting forward. It's likely to happen, but we don't actually know that it will, and we don't know in what way. And then there's the preferable. So that's one of the advantages of foresight, is if we can kind of find a future that we think is likely to happen within the realm of plausibility, and we really like that future, then we can kind of work backwards and see what are the breadcrumbs that led us to that preferable future, and how best can we coax that future to take place, right? Like, what are the kinds of programs from a government perspective? What are the kinds of programs and policies we can implement that can enable that future to be more likely to come true? The wild cards are the black swans I was talking about, these kind of events that suddenly take place that really change our understanding. And then scenarios are basically one of Foresight's final products, where we tell a story about what these futures could look like, so that you have a better understanding, or it's easier to conceive of what these futures could be and how they affect you in the work you do. I also have a nice little cross section of the same thing, just to get an idea. Same kind of idea. So this is what like our futures could behold, right? That there isn't any one single future that Foresight's going to tell you exists. Rather, here's a pan of different future options. deck. Okay. Well, the methodology of strategic foresight. So this is where it becomes kind of a blend of the almost kind of scientific with the creative. So at the beginning stages, we're going to frame what we're going to study. We're going to choose the subject matter. We're going to decide what are the timelines we're looking at within that subject matter. And then we're going to look at the subsections of that subject matter, or the domains. What are the areas within that subject matter that we're specifically interested in? Then we're going to move to the scanning stage, which is, and I think this is one of the lovely things about strategic foresight, is that all information is fair game, right? If you're familiar with the Netflix show Black Mirror, where they kind of explore these sci-fi, like realistic futures, that's to strategic foresight. That is information we can use and collect. Be like, I didn't really think about that. What could that look like? It might not be our most foundational piece of information, but it's certainly important. We interview academics, we interview our colleagues, we interview and just really all kinds of people, whether they're experts or not, to just get more information of people's thought processes about certain subjects. We collect data. All kinds of information are available in our scanning. A lot of it is just kind of reading. It's a lot of reading, a lot of finding. Even Reddit is a good source, for example, of kind of things that are popping up on the horizon. Then we take all of that information, all of everything we've scanned, and we try and make sense of it. So if we're finding all of these pertinent points, what we call weak signals, kind of these, if you can think of like a lighthouse in the fog, this vague glimmer. If we take all of those little vague glimmers and we put them together, and we see kind of an underlying trend that suggests that there's something more going on here, that these weak signals are a consequence of something larger in the system, then we look at those trends and we try and figure out what those are. And then if we look at those trends and we see something even bigger that's impacting those trends, which we call change drivers, that's really kind of the aha moment in foresight. So artificial intelligence is a really good example of how artificial intelligence is transforming essentially everything you can imagine in some way or another. And so the way we conceive of the ways we work, the ways we look at climate change, the ways we do medicine, everything is changing because of artificial intelligence. And so when we find one of those big change drivers, that's really when we start to explore what futures could behold with those multiple change drivers. And those orders of implication are, okay, X happens, then what about Y, then what about Z? So a good example is AI is now proving to be more effective identifying cancers than radiologists. So what does that mean for the profession of radiologists? What does that mean for the treatment of certain cancers? And so on and so forth. And so you can kind of follow these lines of thinking to consider in the future, well, maybe med school needs to incorporate artificial intelligence teaching, or maybe radiology is not an offering at medical schools any longer. So that's kind of where the creativity really kind of comes in, is you're starting to brainstorm and think of this. Then we move to scenarios, and the scenarios is where we, like I said earlier, we kind of story tell what we found. Sometimes it's an image, often it's a paragraph, and it enables people to kind of better conceive of these speculative futures and analyze them more easily, or relate to them more easily. And then finally, we use all of what we've developed to think about things strategically. So what are the policy implications of these futures? How does the program or policy I've created work in these different futures? Does one fail in one scenario, but then policy succeeds in another scenario? Why is that? Can we make it so that they both succeed? And that's really, I think, where foresight's very impactful for public sector, because again, we develop these policies and programs not really thinking about the different ways in which the future could occur. or at the very least, we're only thinking about one or two. So our team, the Strategic Foresight team, we work specifically with human resources. But we also aspire to work within the ESDC community generally. And then we're not limiting ourselves to just the ESDC. If there's a partnership or somebody in the federal public service that wants to work with us, or at the very least network with us, we're down. We're eager to meet foresighters and non-foresighters across government. Our team's kind of is divided right now into two areas. We do projects and we do knowledge sharing. And right now we have one of each going on. So our project right now is in the final stages of development. It's called A Glimpse Ahead, Exploring the Future of the Public Workforce. And it's a lot of what I mentioned before, interviewing people, hosting workshops, doing our own research. And our report came with two sections. So we have the vulnerable assumptions and we have critical uncertainties. So vulnerable assumptions are assumptions that we have that, if proven true, could completely change the way in which we operate, right? So that's not all assumptions, if proven wrong, are bad, and not all assumptions are proven wrong. Some are just true. That's why we assume them. But there are some that are ripe for being wrong, and if so, that can affect the way we operate. So one of the assumptions we used in the report is the public service must be bilingual, right? So that's legislatively mandated. We need to deliver services to Canadians in English and French. We need to communicate internally in English and French. And as a result, we need to hire people most often that are bilingual. But what if we don't need to do that? So again, if we think about artificial intelligence and its natural language processing capabilities, we might be able to translate in this meeting, for example, I don't speak French, but maybe MS Teams is an AI capability that is immediately translating into French. So then maybe bilingualism isn't a necessity, or maybe other languages are just equally as important. Maybe we can start incorporating indigenous languages or newcomers' first languages. So, when we're thinking about our priorities, specifically in human resources, we have to think about what this actually means, and are our assumptions necessarily right? Like, our priorities are based around bilingualism. Is that necessarily the right way to look at things? Similarly, another assumption is the public service will rely on traditional hiring methods to attract and leverage talent. Well, we know in the private sector that those traditionally hiring methods don't really exist. We're seeing the unbundling of jobs, gigification, outsourcing, all of these more nimble, particularized ways of hiring, and public service definitely doesn't do that to the degree we could. And so maybe that's something we need to start thinking about moving forward. Then we have critical uncertainty. So we highlighted a number of questions that we leave to the reader. We're not going to answer these, but we think they're very important, perhaps grave questions that need to be answered. And I have two examples. One is, how will remote work affect accessibility, bias, discrimination, and abuse in the workplace, right? So our HR policies are geared around in-office physical spaces. So how do we consider bias in Zoom or abuse in a virtual reality setting? Are our policies and programs built to consider those things and adapt to those challenges? Another one is, how will advanced technologies affect transparency and information management in the public service? So again, with technologies like virtual reality or AI, we're going to be collecting information and data points at an incredible level, like a huge volume of information. So how are we going to manage all of that data? How are we going to make it available to Canadians when they make ATIP requests? What part of this information is from a public sector or from a public servant perspective is personal information, right? So if my body is in the virtual reality, are those data points my information, or are they the government of Canada's information? And so how does things like liability occur when there's a lawsuit with an AI algorithm versus a public servant's work? So these are all kinds of questions that we need to be kind of considering as we start incorporating these technologies into our everyday work. The other thing we have going on right now is in the knowledge sharing space is the Scan Club. So I openly invite any of you to attend if this interests you. This is where we sit down and we discuss weak signals that we have found under a certain topic area. So recently we did the future of workforce, and my team and I present 2 or 3 weak signals, and we all brainstorm the implications of these weak signals, what it might mean for the world, what it might mean for the public service. We have about 40 to 50 people attend at a time, and it's pretty fun. The last one was quite heated. So I encourage you all to reach out, and we'll add you to our list. Moving forward, we're going to be expanding our team. So projects will mean a report like I just presented, but we're hoping to collaborate with other teams, perhaps consult other teams that are interested in practicing foresight themselves, or want to incorporate an element of foresight into the work. We want to be there to help and facilitate that action. And then on the knowledge sharing side, we will be developing resources to share, but we also want to host workshops and do training for teams. So, teach the person to fish kind of idea so that they can go out and do foresight for themselves. So that's it. Like I said, feel free to reach out to me and or Ryan, and we'll be happy to chat and talk further.
Thank you so much, sir. We'll take questions from the audience, Slido, and chat right after Madame Bugeaud's presentation. Rachelle.
Hello, everyone. So I was going to just start with a bit about myself. So my name is Rachelle Bugeaud. I am a designer and also a futurist. And so a bit about my background, it's always kind of centered around design my whole life. So industrial and product design. And then a couple of years ago, about 4 years ago, I completed my Master's of Design in Strategic Foresight and Innovation. And my master thesis project revolved around remote work and remote workspaces. And so that's what I'll be presenting to you today. And I'm trying to distill all of this research into 10 minutes for you. So it's going to be a bit of a whirlwind, but just hang in there. So I will just share my screen. Which you, I think, are not seeing the right screen. Oh, one moment.
Oh, but it's okay. It's beautiful.
It's beautiful, but it's the wrong screen. So maybe I will just have to do it a little bit more like this, which is not as ideal. Same thing. Let me know. Are you seeing my full screen or no?
Yep, we're good. Thank you.
Now it's full screen? Okay. Technical difficulties as always. So the project is called Regarding Remote Work, and it was really an exploration of the past, the present, and the potential futures of workplace settings. And the thought that catalyzed this work was really back in 2018, thinking to myself, wow, the ways that we're working really seem to be changing, but the environments and the tools and the processes kind of seem to be a little old school, or they're not evolving quite as quickly. And so to give a bit of an overview of the project, there's these 5 sort of big chapters. I don't have time to talk about all of them, so we're going to be skipping A, which is a history of the workspace. But the reason I had done a little bit of a dive into understanding the evolution of workspaces, offices, even just like our daily work lives of working that 9 to 5, where did that come from? But what I'll be talking about today is the B to E, plus a little bonus chapter about hindsight, or what I would have done in this project a little differently. So we're going to start with the where are we now? And this was back in 2018, before the pandemic. So part of the status quo research, I was really interested in learning more about these 4 sort of angles, which was back before the pandemic, people were working remotely, but it was often by choice. So I was really curious to understand what led people to want to work remotely. Further to that was, where are they actually working from? Where do they want to be working from? Or what types of spaces are best suited to support them? And then afterwards, it was a look at, okay, there's remote workers, they're working from environments, but what's currently kind of maybe not as ideal in their current experience? So that ranged from the types of tools that they're using, the spaces that they're in, but also things like isolation, social isolation, and the lack of a community when you're working remotely all the time, or the difficulty in staying focused was another thing that came up often in my research participants. And then that last little segment was really trying to understand, okay, maybe remote work is not necessarily ideal for everyone, but people are developing patterns and tools and little almost like tips, tricks, and hacks for working efficiently from elsewhere. So I was really curious to take a look at those sort of unspoken behaviors or equipment that people use to make the most of working efficiently from literally anywhere. So after that, I did a whole bunch of research with people and encouraged people to work from different types of spaces. And two big sort of findings were, I mean, they seem kind of obvious to say, but there wasn't one size or one solution fits all. And what I mean by this was that if you take the example of a coffee shop and working from home, it was kind of interesting. So it was split pretty much half and half. Half people really, really love working from home, and the other half absolutely hate it because they think it's just too full of distractions. The other half loves working from coffee shops because they love the social quality, the getting out of the house. And then the other half absolutely hates it because it's just too much distraction. So essentially, it was kind of this idea that, or realization that there isn't really an ideal workspace. It really is different for everyone. And that the other part that kind of shifts the need for workspaces really has to do with individual moods, but especially the type of work that needs to get done during that slice of time. So if you're doing, for example, a video call, you probably won't head to that noisy, bustling cafe, which once again seems very obvious to say, but sometimes it's important to let's just lay out the obvious out front so we're all on the same page. So after having done all of that status quo research as a designer, I'm always interested in doing the so what. So it's like, so what? You found all this cool stuff. What are you going to do with it? And so I always like to sort of set out criteria or guidance or guidelines so that when we're designing for the future, or when we're like looking to design solutions, we can keep what we've learned in mind. So the four that I identified for the sort of status quo was that whatever we design for the future of remote workspaces, it would have to be something that increases or boosts, supports efficiency. It has to also have a certain aspect of community so that people feel seen and heard, and they're not just like a ghost in society. But this also has to do with being able to share knowledge with one another. Then there's something about inspiration and self-growth and just discovery, because that's an awesome thing about working remotely, is that you can really get inspired by your environments or challenge yourself to work from different types of spaces, and in so doing, learn about yourself. And then the last one has to do with comfort, and it's not only the physical wellness or like ergonomics, but also the mental wellness and more of that sort of just feeling like everything's right, both physically and mentally. And I guess you could extend that to spiritually as well. All right. So after having looked at everything that was going on kind of in the present, the next phase of research had to do with, let's look at all of the ways in which the world is changing. And this, of course, can become very overwhelming very, very quickly because let's face it, like everything's changing all the time. So for this phase of the project, I was trying my hardest to put the proverbial horse blinders on and just focus on things that particularly would affect the world of work. But even with that being said, it's like there's so much overlap in gray areas. So what I ended up doing was creating 11 macro trends. And macro trends is not necessarily like a real thing. I kind of made up the term, but it was essentially these bigger buckets of like a very, very big trend that plays out over decades. And so even though this research was done 4 years ago, all of these things are still very much present. They don't really go out of fashion, so to speak. So I don't have time to talk about all of the trends, but some of them really had to do with the technology and the evolution of technologies. So augmented reality, kind of incorporating virtual reality as well. Just in essence, that digital world being overlaid onto ours. There's stuff about automation and how that pertains to physical space as well, and smart spaces that can actually respond to you, monitor you, babysit you, who knows? Another phase of trends had to do with looking at more of the behaviors or sort of the value sets of people. So things like leveling up. What that trend is about is really our desire to constantly augment ourselves and our knowledge, most of the time through natural means, but also sometimes through unnatural means in terms of body augmentations, but also when you think of your mind and potentially things like Neuralink or like brain implants. Other than that, there's something also about what I called kind of like the woke culture, or just being a little bit more critical and sensitive of the systems that surround us, but always with the view towards making the future sort of more inclusive and more supportive for all. And then there's also something about hybrid spaces, or our use of urban spaces, to be a little bit more flexible and shared. So with all of these trends in mind, my next task was to develop 4 future scenarios, or like snippets of the future. This, I will not lie, is very challenging doing solo. So my 4 scenarios were set approximately 20 years into the future. So having written these in 2018, I'm not a mathematician, but let's just call it 20 years into the future. And some of the sort of themes that I was curious in better understanding or exploring was whether technology was going to be very much integrated and accepted as a work tool, or whether it was going to be sort of feared or contained, or perhaps even regulated in some ways. And the other one was really whether work and life were going to become very sort of meshed together, or whether they were going to be kept quite separate in terms of that 9 to 5 or like working hours. So for the 4 scenarios, I always like to think of scenarios for me personally as types of like metaphors, or different sort of symbolic views of an industry into the future. And so for me, the first one was really about, what if the workspace becomes more of this like extra employee benefit? And what I mean by that is kind of looking at company towns, those very sort of expansive and fancy workspaces that we see big tech companies have, as a bid to really try and retain employees. So that's kind of the catalyst for this scenario, but taking it one step further so that the workspace really becomes almost like a trap. It's not only about you have a nice job, but it's also like, okay, now you can't really ever leave because your workspace is your house that is sponsored by the company for which you work. So that's like the first scenario. The second scenario is a little bit happier. It's more about co-living and co-working, but the workspace is very much like a community hub that you go to in order to exchange information with others and sort of learn from one another, so that in this world, everyone's pretty much just a gig worker or a contract worker, and we're all just kind of sharing information together and working from collective spaces. The third one was more of a technology-driven, like heavily technology-driven one, which had to do with augmented reality and the idea that a workspace is very much supported by work tools, and that a work tool, something like the future evolution of a laptop, would become something that becomes kind of required by all citizens, almost like a passport of sorts. It's like your passport to work. So you need this thing, and you need to plug this thing into your surroundings in order to access your workspace. And then the very last one had to do with thinking of the workspace as a reward. So really looking at throughout history, you know, like the idea of the corner office or the penthouse or space has always kind of served a bit as a bragging right or as a reward system. So using that and extrapolating it into the future so that you essentially have a society that's so motivated by work that the more you work, the more you earn the right to work from fancier places or more exclusive workspaces. And so to kind of wrap it all up, because I know I wanted to try and keep this at 10 minutes, but some of the insights that I gained from this whole project, I won't necessarily talk about all of them, but some had to do with artificial intelligence and the use of digital tools, and how currently we're kind of, I mean, I'm speaking for everyone here, but I feel like we're a little bit scared of artificial intelligence and the use of too much digital tools in our work life. We kind of fear a little bit that they might just take our jobs or replace us. But perhaps trying to view it more as a symbiotic relationship where they were really looking to augment one another. So that kind of pertains to that first bit about what if the workspace actually becomes more of this personality or a coach, or it's a program that coaches you to get your work done and also sort of progress throughout your career. It's almost like a life coach, but it's also a workspace that's able to protect you from distractions or protect you from unwanted attention, perhaps. The second one had to do with, once again, kind of technology, but this time applied to physical space. So looking at how we can use technology in order to augment our physical spaces so that the spaces become a little bit more responsive or smart. So that we don't need as many spaces because each one can kind of be adapted or is flexible enough to suit anyone's needs. There's also something about just in terms of materiality and just the footprint of workspaces, looking at things that are a little bit more heirloom in quality or shareable. So things like co-working, but also in terms of equipment. And then these last four, I think there's a little bit of overlap as well. But one of the things was that there almost is, like, currently it's the 9-to-5 model, but even 9-to-5 is kind of becoming diluted, and you have more and more people just choosing their own work hours or going to the 4-day work weeks. And so I think into the future as well, we're going to be seeing more of that sort of just fuzzying of the work hours and work lifestyles, and that we're going to just have to accept whatever cadence or formula that everyone kind of develops for themselves, as long as it kind of gets the job done. No one's here to judge. So we're just kind of being very inclusive in terms of designing your own work-life balance. And yeah, I think the big thing is just always being mindful that whatever we're designing has the future in mind, so that it is resilient, it is adaptable, perhaps modular, and it really uses underutilized spaces or revisits kind of present day assumptions or systems that we may think are too big to even shift. It all kind of starts with just chipping away at it. And to sort of summarize everything, this is the bonus chapter of, if I had to redo this project from scratch, what would I do differently? And I feel like I would do a lot differently. But the majority of it kind of centers around those two central chapters of like looking at the trends and building the scenarios. As this was really my first solo strategic foresight project, there was a little bit of that panic because I'm like, oh, I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm learning on the go. Now, looking back, I've learned a lot more about the tools and the processes, and I would do this entire phase a little bit differently. One of them is placing a lot less emphasis on the use of technology and kind of really taking time to explore what are the other shifts that are happening in the rest of the world. And I did a little bit of this in terms of building out the macro worlds, but I wish I had time to do more. That kind of links to the one below it, which is just having enough time, which is a luxury, but having a bit more time to really build out the different worlds. Because in order to do foresight correctly and to its like full potential, it's always beneficial to look at the ways in which the surrounding industries are also evolving or changing, because shifts in healthcare may impact your industry, or a shift in sort of the financial world may have big repercussions on the education world or something like that. So kind of looking at the ways in which the world as a whole is changing instead of just a very, very focused cluster, I think would be beneficial. And then the two last ones is currently the way I wrote the scenarios where literally they're each set in a different part of the world. And I think it might have been a little bit more beneficial if I had just chosen one city or one country and just made all the scenarios fit that area, just in terms of being a little bit easier to compare and contrast them. And to finish it off, if I was to redo this project, obviously I would love to just have more people and more voices in terms of the scenario and the implication building. I included a lot of people in the prior phases of my work in terms of the researching with remote workers, but it would have been awesome to actually have more workshops so that the scenarios were more of a collective vision of the futures. So I think that's it.
That was wonderful, Rachelle. Thank you so much. I have a question regarding one of the trends you identify, the holacracy. Holacracy? I don't even know how to say that.
Holacracy.
What is that?
Holacracy. Yeah, essentially, holacracy is basically the lack of a formal sort of hierarchy at work. So it's like a bit on the edge, and there's a couple companies that have tried this out, I think to mixed effect, but essentially right now it's, you have like your boss, your superior, and a sort of chain of
Very vertical authority.
communication and
Yeah.
authority. And in a holacracy, it's everyone is very much equal and it's shared responsibility, and there is no official leader, so to speak. I think which company is it that I'm sure if you Google it, you'll
Yeah.
see there's a company that tried it out. And I think it was all the buzz back in like 2016, 17, 18. And then I think they probably figured out that like, hey, maybe there's a reason we have like chains of command. Yeah. So I think
Perhaps it
also
crashed.
if I was to revisit some of the projects, it would be looking at some of these trends and how these trends have either like tanked or grown.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Moss, for sharing that information. So let's go to Slido for a bit. How can we begin leveraging foresight research today? I think the application might be a bit of a challenge when you're talking about, the future. You probably get a crazy looks and be like, I'm sorry, what is your job exactly? So, A, how do you overcome that? Besides being super resilient, and also like how are you finding that experience for you in terms of application of the field and tangible like outputs, deliverables? We're used to widgets. We're sorry, but like, can you speak to that for a sec?
Sure. I mean, I can go first, I guess. For me, it's always been a bit of a challenge because I think strategic foresight lends itself very well to the world of business and reports. And yet I find reports are potentially not the most exciting format that our insights can take. And so what I'm very much curious in developing and pursuing is using more of my like sort of design lens in order to transform future insights into things that people can actually touch, hold, look at, converse, have like conversations about, so that it becomes a lot less abstract and a lot less elitist of like, here's my future, like, look at it, tell me what you think. But it's more about, hey, what do you think if this was to exist? Like, do we want this to exist? Are there any sort of big red flags that we should be mitigating? And so I think for me, the best use of foresight is really as a tool for conversation, for inviting others' perspectives into the future, and to also demystify it so that it's not about reading your palm or some magic crystal ball, but it's really centered around data and behaviors. And it is a little bit more scientific, but also artistic. So.
Thank you. Mr. Moss, anything to add?
Yeah, I think it is a little bit different in the public sector context, but I think what's important is, and Rachelle kind of like alluded to this, is that it doesn't have to be this big, massive report as the materials that is presented and digested. Like, I think what's important is that groundwork is developed and that those insights are created, but then whatever is presented or is incorporated in the policy and program design, so that it becomes an element of your development process, as opposed to this external report thing that you have to read and then kind of apply to your own work. And that's kind of one of the goals, at least I have with our team, is to make it more of an incorporative exercise as opposed to this external thing that you have to kind of worry about.
Yeah, really good point. Thank you. And also that addresses Robert's point in the chat. Technology changes for public servants can be predicted quite well 5 years in advance. We have like a 10-year lag within the federal public service. Privacy changes are coming to HR admin and systems, but are we preparing for more than 2 years out? And what are your views on that? So Rachelle and Adon, I have my own. I'll keep them for the end.
I think it's always quite tricky. I mean, I worked at a bank in the financial industry for a year or so as a strategic foresight lead. And I think it's the same sort of tension where, it feels like a luxury to really look more than 2 years out, even. It kind of feels like, oh, well, it's cool, but like we have these immediate bushfires and like things that we should really be worrying about right now. So like, let's just worry about what's going to happen in 10 years, like later. But my sort of counter to that is that even if you just take one afternoon or 1 week out of your whole year to just investigate potential futures or potential implications, it's really like the amount of time that we take to look at, I don't know, training modules and compliance modules, et cetera. It's like we could be investing the same amount of time into just looking at the future, or just having one day a year where it's just dedicated to the future. And that way you can really start to just open up your mind as well and just become a little bit more, I guess, aware of change as well, because it's really a recurring thing. So in order to answer the question of like, okay, should we be looking more than 2 years out, or how do we challenge ourselves to be doing that when it seems like there's so much immediately pressing things? And I would say, obviously, keep dealing with the emergency pressing stuff, but give yourself, set aside half a day or a couple minutes in a week to just take the time to think of these other issues that maybe don't feel quite as important right now, but you'd be very surprised how quickly things can change. And yeah.
So two things that I'm going to react to on that. So futures retreat, excellent idea.
Yeah.
We'll put it down for next year, next fiscal.
Exactly.
And also I'm happy to hear that. I think that what our team provides in terms of a foresight space with the scan clubs, with these sessions, is exactly this. Like, we understand that you have emergent or issues that you need to tackle right now. However, let's take this itty bitty time to focus on future and imagine the impacts and the implications that that would have for our workplace and our workforce. So, thank you. Anything to add, Aiden?
Yeah, a couple of things. One is that, foresight is intimately connected to service design and user-centered design principles. So I think like you don't have to do foresight in and of itself. Like if you're, I think especially my background's policy development and I guess some strategy as well as like if you want to do those things properly, you need to be having user-centered design principles at the core of your work. And foresight can be added to that as part of that process. So I think you don't have to look at it as, again, as a separate entity, but it can be a part of a kind of a sea change in how you do these things. I also think, we had the same challenges in the past when we didn't do gender-based like lenses or, indigenous people's lenses or, other ways in which we look at how we develop policies and programs. So this is just one other lens that we can use that I think is becoming more and more necessary as things change faster and faster to incorporate into how we plan and design.
Mhm.
Totally agree and appreciate that. Yeah, thank you. Question from Slido. What are your go-to sources for foresight insights? Like, who are you stalking on social media? What are you subscribing to? People or companies you follow online, magazines, blogs, etc.
Oof. I feel like I follow way too many. So I'm trying to think of some. I
First.
was like, I could provide potentially like a list later on. Off the top of my head, I'm trying to even, there's a couple newsletters that are really good. And I tend to like newsletters because they try to make sure that it's kind of a little simplified and usually just once a week because what I've found is that the world of futures and foresight, especially when it comes online, it's very exponential.
Mhm.
And it's just, there is so much out there. But I think I particularly like the ones that more of the weak signals or like the really sort of fringe finds. That's this type of stuff that gets me the most excited. So a lot of those have to be probably more newsletters or blogs. Even LinkedIn sometimes have like, if you just follow certain people on LinkedIn, they share a lot of kind of cool findings. So yeah, I try to limit a bit myself because
Focus
it's,
your attention,
yeah, exactly. Because if not, it is a rabbit hole that's just never ending.
like on any topic. Mr.
Yeah.
Moss?
Yeah, newsletters. Yeah, I think that's a good one. We were having a conversation about newsletters yesterday, interestingly enough. Um, Reddit's also a good one. They have, I think it's like Reddit/Futures or something, and people are doing the work for you, and it's pretty good one. There's a couple of sites that actually do like their own insights and trends. One is quantumrun.com, and I'm trying to find the other one. But what I do is I have like a chunk of time in my schedule once a week where I open 40 pages
That's
and and then they're just they range from National Geographic to Business Insider and then everything in between and just kind of like scan those and that is kind of the thing you might find a commonality amongst those, but oh, I've read that 5 times now. It's like,
mm,
is that media copying each other or is that something that's kind of pertinent that keeps popping up?
Mhm.
that's a good point. Thank you. So one last question, and then we'll try to end earlier, at least on time. To what extent is foresight being done comprehensively or collaboratively across the Government of Canada, especially for HR innovation? Are others, for example, OCRO, involved? Um, any ideas on that front from our audience? Perhaps you are here on behalf of your own foresight unit within your department, and we are learning about you today, or perhaps we already know about you, and that's why we reached out to you. What are your impressions? I have my own thoughts again.
I was going to let you answer it anyway. So
So I think it's what we're trying to do. I think building foresight units is a challenge. I think that there's a culture of resistance right now where like Rachelle said, we're focused on the right now. We're focused, like Robert said, on the next 2 years, but we're not really looking at the future, where a lot of our problems could be addressed today for making things better for our the next generation even. So for me, it's all about building and incorporating that foresight capacity logically and deliberately into anything that we do, specifically when it comes to policy because we need to be more flexible and agile when it comes to that. We cater to a 300,000 plus employee workforce. So it's going to be pretty important that we remain pertinent and that we remain future oriented. Yeah. So that's what I say. But yes, we do reach out to Okro in everything that we do, just because we know that if anything should change, it's going to change from the center, but the application is going to be within departments, and that's an exciting opportunity. Donc, Rachel, Aiden, thank you both so much for your time. Participants, thank you again for showing up. We will see you next month for our next topic. Et en attendant, please stay safe, stay happy, and see you next time. Merci beaucoup.
Great. Yeah, merci beaucoup. Bye.
thank
Bye.
you. Bye.